And good morning, everyone. It's great to be here, and what a fabulous turnout that we have. And it was only in September that I joined many of you at really the precursor to this, which was the industry drinks that Jason and the team organised. And it was such a vibrant evening, and there were so many great conversations that we started. So to see everyone here today to continue the conversation, that's what it's all about. And as Morgan said, it's great to see some men here, and it's always interesting to chat to some of the men who say, I don't know what it feels like to be a minority in terms of attending some events or in the workplace generally. So let's keep encouraging the men to come along to some of these conversations. And the beauty of us all coming together as an industry, I mean, obviously there's so much happening in our own individual workplaces. We all have our own plans and strategies and aspirations, but the power comes when we band together and we actually hear some different perspectives. And maybe we reflect on some of that and we bring it back to our own workplace. So the importance of these events for me are huge. So I don't have a lot of time, and I could talk all day about this. This is the stuff I really love doing, I have to say. But when I sort of reflected last night on what are some of the key messages that I wanted to share with you as I look back on my career and some of the things that are very front of mind for us at AECOM at the moment, and just when I get asked, sort of one-on-one, particularly by young women coming up in our industry, what are some of the tips that I would offer them? I think it really comes down to a few key points. And some of this is very much focused on experience and confidence, but I think it is about a few key points. Number one, I think, and we all work in this sort of construction and development industry. I think most of us in the room, whether we come at it from a design or planning or marketing or legal perspective, we're very familiar with the term project management, and I think we all need to look at our own careers, regardless of which stage we're at in our career, whether we're starting out in the first couple of years or whether we're into the second or third or fourth decade. Sometimes you've got to be a bit selfish, and you've got to think about your career as a project. So just like you would manage a project at work, you have to sit down sometimes and plan out and say, what are the things that are going to be really important for me this year that I want to achieve? And sometimes that involves some difficult conversations, just like it does at work with clients sometimes. So I think that tip about managing your career like a project is an important one. Being bold is the second point, and this is a hard one, and it does come sometimes with confidence. But I think if you all think about it, and I know this was certainly my experience as I sort of progressed year on year. Sometimes I used to leave a meeting early on in my career where I would be, for example, the only woman in the room, and there'd be 10 other men on our side, on the client side, who were much more experienced, who had 10, 20 years more experience. And I remember thinking, I actually had a really important point to say, or I had a better answer to that, or I had a better idea. And I would say, I would sort of kick myself afterwards and say, why didn't I say that? And contrast that with an example certainly that's very personal to me. I had a woman manager back in Australia where I started working who used to be the opposite of that, and she would say, you've got to say something all the time, and you've got to be like a man, you've got to actually bang the table a bit, you've got to use a few swear words. And I've got to say, that completely turned me off. And when I started to reflect on that, I thought, no, what's wrong with actually just being yourself, but actually backing yourself to be bold and have a point of view? So I think that was another key point for me, and one that even today, I think regardless of how daunting, the environment or a different setting that we might be in, I think trusting your instinct is a really important tip that I would also share as well. And being yourself, because that is what makes us unique. It does provide that sort of individuality, that diversity of thought, that diversity of perspective. So I think when you really distill it down, they were the three sort of headlines for me. So I think let's continue some of these conversations, and it's a great program today. And I just wanted to thank Jason and the Middle East Consultant magazine team and for putting on a summit like today. There is I'm based in London, but I spend a lot of my time in the Middle East. I was spending a lot of time in places like Saudi Arabia at the moment in particular. There is a lot of pent-up demand, I would say, in our industry to have many more conversations like this. So I really commend Jason and the team for, hopefully this is the first of many ongoing conversations. And maybe there are some specific topics or focus areas that we feel are unique to this market that warrant some further exploration that we can take away after today, that would be certainly great to see, and I'll be following up with many of you. So look, I think on to some other specific points for myself. So a few personal reflections and then maybe some more practical tips and a bit more about myself. So I've spent close to the last 30 years working in engineering and construction. So my role the last few years has been the Chief Executive of the EMEA region for AECOM. So we're a Fortune 500 design and engineering and project management consultant firm, mainly in the infrastructure sector, but obviously we interface a lot with the construction professionals, which many of you represent. And I think, as was noted earlier, we're not the best sector in terms of the visibility of senior, women rising through the ranks in terms of senior leadership roles. We are certainly not the standout performer in terms of some other indices that are receiving important attention at the moment, such as concepts like pay equity, which certainly where I came from in Australia in the last few years has received a lot of prominence, where companies are now required to report on what they're doing around pay equity, and it's happening now in places like the UK as well. So it's only a matter of time before even that conversation, as an example, will become more prominent here in the Middle East. So I think we have a great opportunity in this sector to put some of the issues out there, have frank conversations, but more importantly, come together and have some practical steps that we're going to, focus on. And that power, as I said earlier, comes in terms of taking a broader industry view and understanding the practicalities. And for example, there are definitely some physical constraints about, radically increasing the proportion of women out in some, on some work sites, for example, in some parts of the world. But let's have a discussion about that. So the team that I look after is about 20,000 professionals, and we generate several $1 billion of revenue. When I came into this role a couple of years ago, being very candid with you, I noticed that a lot of the discussions around the progression of women and gender diversity, and we are talking a lot about gender diversity today, it had fallen off the agenda. And coming again, I raise Australia. I think Australia and New Zealand have been very progressive in the last few years with respect to making sure that it's back on the agenda. But it does receive a lot of government backing to make sure that, and industry backing, whether it's through the Property Council or whether it's through key infrastructure bodies. There was a groundswell of support to make that happen. So, even in companies like our own, we'd had things like diversity inclusion panels. We had quite a lot of momentum historically, but it had just, as happens, right? I mean, there's a lot of other competing pressures. We'd allowed it to sort of fall off the agenda, and it didn't have the same prominence on the business agenda like the P&L performance, like the safety performance. I think safety is a really important parallel to talk about. I mean, we know in our industry just how prominent the safety culture, and particularly here in the Middle East, there has been so much improvement and conversation and marked increase in terms of just seeing the safety culture. We've got to approach, I think, the discussion on the progression of women and the gender diversity in the same way. It's a cultural issue, it's a leadership issue. There's an interesting train of thought that says it's purely a men's issue. I don't think it is. I mean, obviously men continue to occupy most of the leadership roles in business, but I actually do believe it's a leadership issue, because leaders are the ones, I mean, people like myself, we have a platform, we have the power to drive change within our own organisations. And then when you think down within your own organisations, it's not just the most senior leaders, a lot of the traction and the momentum and the change will happen from the leaders, men and women, who actually have the influence to drive that change, who have the power to make decisions around, which people will work on which projects. They also have the power to decide who gets recruited and who doesn't, who receives end-of-year progression, who receives a certain pay rise, who receives some sort of recognition. So I think it's absolutely the leaders. And sometimes we have to, when we look at our own organisations, there seems to be good understanding around, the business conversation around the importance of gender diversity, but sometimes, it's that next level down that we have to empower and maybe give some more practical tools and tactics with and get them to understand just some of the ongoing biases that can creep into work. I mean, not intentionally. I mean, I think we've got to appreciate most managers don't say, I have an agenda not to promote the progression of women. Sometimes they don't know how to do it. And I think that's certainly a lesson for me. I remember one conversation that I had with a boss of mine many years ago, and I just had my twins, and so I was returning to work part-time, and I had a sort of director level role in the organisation. And I remember I received a phone call from him at home. It was one of the days that I wasn't working. And he said to me, we have, we're doing a lot of restructuring at work. We have a big MD role coming up, and it involves, the new MD bringing together three new acquired companies. And he went on and said, it requires a lot of travel. It's very demanding role. There's a lot of conflict in terms of how we bring these three organisations together. And he went on and on and on for about 10 minutes, almost explaining to me already why I couldn't do the job. And then he said to me at the end, so I guess I just wanted to let you know that, I think you would have been great for it, but I can understand 100% why you probably wouldn't want to do it. And so I remember saying to him at the time, well, actually, that sounds amazing. And, I'm not currently sort of set up in terms of how my husband and I or my family sort of support system would make that work. But how about I think about that and I give you a call back tomorrow? And the moral of the story was that I talked to my husband about it, and I took that job. But my boss at the time and I reflected on that very pivotal conversation, and he just apologised over and over again. He didn't have bad intention when he rang me that day. He was coming at it from his own personal reference point, and he said to me, I was used to my wife not working and staying at home and looking after our two children, so I was trying to support you in terms of not wanting you to feel pressure. But inadvertently, what happened was he was effectively making me feel like I was discounted from that opportunity. So we often talked about that example for many years afterwards. The poor guy, I mean, he was the sort of example for that. But it just shows you the importance of leaders and people who hold the power for some of those, critical career decisions to not come in with any bias around a person's, male or female, current circumstances or how they might apply themselves to a future challenge going forward. So, so many interesting examples. Obviously, coming to, work in a place like the Middle East, I have been blown away by, look at our own organisation. We've got a great table here today, but there are so many talented young women who, are ready for that next career challenge. So I think the more and more we can, share, like I said, some of the practical examples that each of us are sort of promoting at our own workplace and giving some prominence and a voice to, the opportunity that exists in this sector to really take a lead. I think that's what we should focus on. Some other practical tips from me. Building your networks. I know this is a really hard one. I remember sometimes when I was working on projects and we were working very long hours and there was the opportunity, for example, to join some colleagues for industry networking drinks or something at 7 o'clock, and you'd have to go into town and you'd have to get the train home or something. Some days, we know what it's like. You can think of nothing worse. I can imagine here in the summertime, in particular. You can't think of anything worse. You've had a busy day and there's an opportunity to attend some industry networking events. Push yourself to go to some of those because you might surprise yourself by finding such a great source of, support. It's different than the support that exists at work. It's relatively easy to talk about some of these things sometimes and to hear what's happening. Sometimes it's reassuring to know that we're not the only ones or we might not be the only organisation. But for example, it's very empowering also to hear what other companies might be doing to really take a leadership role with respect to maternity leave. We were talking about that this morning, or workplace flexibility, or mentoring schemes, and you can be armed with some of that real information and bring it back to your own workplace. And not only that, sometimes you can make great friends and catch up informally for a coffee with some other, friends that you make in the industry and have a very independent conversation and seek some advice differently to what you might be able to do at work, where you might feel that you might not be able to do that. So I think those industry networks are key. And even for me, there are a number of forums where we come together with other industry CEOs, and I always learn something in terms of what's happening in other organisations. So it's really important. A practical example of that, while we talk about our own workplace, very simple but very powerful. We have, over the last few years, particularly in the EMEA region and in the Australia-New Zealand region, we started these, what we call M-circles, which are really built on the Sheryl Sandberg concept of leaning in and having someone else to sort of, share and talk to a lot of the sort of workplace issues that are most important to you. So this is, our aspiration has been that there would be an M-circle operating in every single one of our offices in AECOM, and there would be a leader in that particular office, men or women, who would be the moderator. The local group would come up with the 2 or 3 key things that were very important for the women in that location. And it's interesting to see, sometimes there are some very similar topics that are coming up, whether it's in Australia or London or Abu Dhabi. But one that comes up consistently is, how do I get support with having some difficult conversations about myself and my own career progression? And we were able to bring in some external speakers, other leaders, a whole range of people who were then able to facilitate a very candid conversation around, how you get organised for some of these conversations. So I think it's some very simple, and things like that don't cost, a lot of money. It's just the commitment to make sure that a few times a year you're coming together. So I think that was one very practical example that I know that I've shared with a lot of colleagues in other businesses. Mentoring and sponsorship, obviously there's a lot of discussion around that. I think, and many of you would have quite structured mentoring schemes. I can't, overemphasise how important I think informal and formal mentoring networks are. And again, I think there's an interesting discussion going on around the importance of sponsorship. Certainly in my workplace, we have had a program for the last 18 months of active sponsorship. Everyone in my executive team has been assigned to, high potential women, and, we are accountable to each other to make sure that we are talking about and being accountable for what we are personally doing to assist these women with their own career progression. So that's the difference between the sponsoring and the mentoring. So mentoring, you generally talk to. Sponsors have to have a commitment to talk about and promote and make themselves accountable for the progression of these women. So I think mentoring and sponsoring, the importance of those two concepts is very important. Another key tip, staying agile. And I think this is all about being open to taking on some different career opportunities. Sometimes it involves taking on a role in a different location. Global mobility happened for me quite late in my career, moving to the UK after working for, the rest of my career in Australia. So that was a big move. It's complicated. It's not as easy as everyone thinks, but it really put me outside of my comfort zone. And I am so pleased that, moving from Australia to London is relatively culturally easy, I would say. Obviously, it's a much bigger market. There's complexity in terms of the work that we do in Europe. But I have absolutely loved working in the Middle East because, as many of you know, there is such, a difference in terms of how business is done. It's been fascinating for me. The biggest cultural learning for me has been the last 2 years working in Saudi Arabia, where there's such a huge rate of social change and transformation going on, and being part of that. And so all of, these types of conversation, there's a real hunger for that. And there's a real commitment to, developing that next generation of men and women. And so this is where partnerships with universities to talk about the importance of STEM careers and careers in construction, given the very ambitious development agenda, is absolutely critical. So be open to some of those moves. Sometimes those moves can be lateral ones. I know I've certainly taken on opportunities to work for a year or two in a very different business unit. It might not seem like a vertical progression, but it's more of that lattice style of, horizontal and lateral progression, which then gave me the opportunity to have some different perspectives in another part of the business. Secondments to client organisations. I've done a number of long-term secondments. I think they're really important for you to understand the sort of customer perspective, and again, just see how, you know, amazingly different it can be working in, you know, a client organisation, for example. So I would really encourage people to do that. So back to being bold. As I said, having your own style and bringing that to work is the most important thing for me. A couple of other areas that I think we need to continue to push ourselves. Asking for feedback is hard, and sometimes you want to do that initially with people who you trust and value, and you have to encourage them to almost be very candid with that feedback. Sometimes it's easier to say, okay, well, what are some of my strengths and some of the areas for improvement? There's different ways of framing that conversation, but I think being open to feedback is really important. And when it comes to our careers, I think it's critically important. I've seen so many times over the years, people come and see me after their end of year performance appraisals and they say, I'm really so disappointed because I thought this year I was going to be promoted to director level, or I thought I was going to be the top pick for, you know, being considered for this role. And when you peel that conversation back, the most practical tip that I have is you've got to get out in front of those conversations. And I say this to men as well. It's too late when you're disappointed at the end of the year. So it's really important to set those goals and have alignment between you and your manager, so everyone is clear on what are the practical things that the manager and the employee are going to do to get there at the end of the year. So I think that absolutely works, so that there's no surprises on either side. So I think, again, that's an example of managing your career like a project. Just like you have deliverables and you have milestones, the same with your career. Make your aspirations known. Sometimes, I mean, as women, I can tell you, I mean, I never used to be as bold as some of the men in our organisation who would say, you know, 3 years I want to be the CEO, or I think I should be getting paid this much. I think many of us feel the same way. We don't sort of, you know, talk about it like that. So, but sometimes, I mean, particularly when you're having those career planning conversations, back yourself and say, this is my aspiration, you know, don't give it maybe a fixed time, but I see myself progressing to this, or I'd like to, you know, what do you think are some of the skills or the attributes or the experiences that I might need to round out in that path to sort of get towards that aspiration. Finally, on this topic, pay and progression. Really hard to have a conversation around pay. I know, and I'm speaking from example. I have been in the past a really bad example. I think I got to probably the first 20 years of working in AECOM, and I never once spoke about my salary expectations, which is bad. It's really bad. And yet here were lots of senior men who I was their manager coming to me, well prepared, well armed, and saying, you know, I've got some of the latest industry benchmarking information. I know what competitor X is paying. So they would come to me well prepared for a conversation, and I'm thinking, I'm not even having that conversation with my own manager. And I remember I had a conversation with my boss, and he said to me, why aren't you talking to me about this? Why aren't you sort of jumping over the couch and leaping out and saying, yeah, I'm ready to do that job, and this is what let's have a conversation around salary. It's a really hard one, and I've got to generalise and say, I think women are not as good as men in having that conversation, but I've learnt that to be organised and to make sure that I am putting that on the agenda too. So I would encourage you to, again, and this is a good one to get some, practical sort of advice from. Be well prepared though. I mean, don't pluck numbers out of the sky, but there's plenty of industry information out there around what the market is paying. And again, if you've done that homework around ticking the boxes with your progression at the same time, I think that's the sort of level of planning that would be good. And then just back yourself to have that conversation. So I think there's some food for thought. In terms of inspiring the next generation of professionals, I think, I'm an optimist. I think, again, conversations like what we're going to have today are a good start. Our own organisations, we're on a journey. That's what I say about our own organisation. I'm pleased to say that here in the Middle East, we're pretty much at 50-50 now in terms of our graduate intake. I mean, it starts with graduate intake. I mean, if you can't get that balance in the early years, we know how hard it is to maintain that pipeline. And sometimes, and we've certainly recognised that we need to supplement the pipeline, with lateral hires and to keep that that diversity going. Some other things, we also have recognised, particularly from the strong engineering base that our firm has, the engagement, there's good engagement in terms of relationships with universities. We have to start a lot earlier though, just to continue to promote the benefits of a great career in STEM much earlier with getting back into school. So again, I think as a sector, that's certainly something that we can do. And certainly for International Women's Day this year, we had female students from 2 international schools in Abu Dhabi who came into our offices and learnt about what engineers really do, so and dispel some of those myths. And I'm really pleased to say that we have a cooperation agreement now with Princess Noura University in Riyadh, back to the comment around Saudi, where I think there's dramatic opportunity for the progression of women. So I hope my short story has provided at least some ideas for you, or some conversation starters. And remember, as I said earlier, let's back ourselves, let's trust our instinct, and give ourselves the confidence for next time. I hope you have a great day. I think another practical tip, make yourself introduce yourself to at least 3 other people that you've not met before, and take yourself outside of that comfort zone, which, as I said, I used to struggle with, but I think it's another little tip. So thank you for listening, and have a great day. Thank you again.